The idea of free and equal persons. To this point, we have simply used the idea of free and equal persons. We must now explain its meaning and role. Justice is fairness regards citizens as engaged in social cooperation and hence is fully capable of doing so. And this is over a complete life. Persons so regarded have what we may call the two moral powers, explained as follows. So all the people or the person that are engaged in justice as fairness, maybe they are implementing justice as fairness, or it is being implemented on them. Both of them have two moral powers, all of the people. One such power is the capacity for a sense of justice. It is a capacity to understand, to apply, and to act from, and not merely in accordance with principles of political justice that specify the fair terms of social cooperation. So all the people who are engaged in implementing the justice as fairness thing, or on whom justice as fairness is being implemented, all of them are expected to have a sense of justice within them, a minimum criteria of justice where from a base or a standard from there they can work upon justice. The other moral power is a capacity for a conception of the good. So, one moral power they have is a sense of justice. They have a fairly good idea of what justice is, how it should be implemented in all terms. Okay, and then the other is the conception of good. They know what is good. It is a capacity to have, to revise, and rationally to pursue a conception of the good. Such a conception is an ordered family of final ends and aims which specifies a person's conception of what is of value in human life, or alternatively, what is regarded as a fully worthwhile life. So those people have an idea of what is good, how that good has to be implemented into people's life, and what it is that makes a person's life worth living. The elements of such a conception are normally set within and interpreted by certain comprehensive religious, philosophical, or moral doctrines in the light of which the various ends and aims are ordered and understood. So, in the light of religious and philosophical and moral doctrines, okay, so in some way or the other, okay, if a person is religious, then according to or through religion, that person has an idea of what is good. The person has the conception of good. If the person say is not religious, then through philosophy the person knows what is good, what is bad, what we read in ethics and how we apply ethics, practical ethics. So, somewhere or the other, whether the person is religious or not, whether the person has an understanding or a knowledge of philosophical works or not, according to the moral doctrines, somewhere or the other, the person has the power of conception of good. And these two are moral powers that the person possesses, because the person has inherited in it a sense of justice and a sense of good, and it is a power because those are the standpoints from which one can make fair and good and justifiable laws. So it's a power because the person doesn't have to learn it externally, it is there in every being. In saying that persons are regarded as having the two moral powers, we're saying that they have requisite capacities not only to engage in mutually beneficial social cooperation over a complete life, but also to be moved to honor in fair terms for their own sake. In theory, these two powers are taken as defining moral persons and moral personality. What is meant though by saying that persons are free and equal? So when we say that the people have power, people have these two powers, moral powers, that they have a sense of justice and that they have a sense of goodness. It is not something that they have to exhibit or force themselves to do throughout their complete life. So it will come very easily and very naturally to them. So when they are working on the laws, when they're making laws, when they're implementing the laws, when they're following the laws throughout their life, they won't have to struggle with the basic things like doing justice and doing good to people. So, what it is that we mean by saying a person is free and a person is equal? What does freedom and equality mean? Here, it is important to keep in mind. Also, I would like to add a point here. Freedom and equality are many times negotiated to be utopian principles, which, no matter how anybody tries, will not be achievable in in its perfect sense. So let's see what Rawls has to say about it. Here it is important to keep in mind that justice as fairness is a political conception of justice, that is, it is designed for the special case of the basic structure of society and is not intended as a comprehensive moral doctrine. Okay, so when we talk about justice as fairness, now again and again, as I've told you this before, these are the different tools to implement the one goal of society, that is justice as fairness. So here, what Rawls is trying to tell us is that justice as fairness is not a very comprehensive, not a very worked out and detailed moral doctrine that everybody has to follow, that everybody is restricted by, they have to learn the code of conduct and all of that stuff. It is a very simple procedure and it is designed for the very basic structure of the society. So it is something that we have to work zero upon. Okay, we have to put in zero effort upon it to achieve that goal. Therefore, the idea of the person when specified into a conception of the person belongs to a political conception. A fundamental idea becomes a conception if we specify its elements in a particular way. So if we have to make an idea very fundamental in our lives, we have to mix it in our lives such as that we don't even notice it anymore, that we are actually doing something extra and putting in some efforts to implement that idea. There are certain ways in which the elements have to put together so that it becomes fundamental in our life. This means that the conception of the person is not taken from metaphysics, the philosophy of mind, or from psychology. It may have little relation to conceptions of the self discussed in those disciplines. It must of course be compatible with such philosophical or psychological conceptions, but that is another story. The conception of the person itself is meant as both normative and political, not metaphysical or psychological. So when we have to make an idea fundamental in our life so that it is, it does not stand out as being done something extra or out of the natural course of life, that idea has little relation to conceptions of the self discussed. So basically, we are talking not about, that idea has to be normative and that idea has to be political. And these two, only if the idea is normative and political. So we have already talked about the positive sciences and the normative sciences, and how normative sciences do not work as much upon facts but on standards, and they involve a lot of judgment. So basically, normative and political has the idea has to be normative and political so that it applies to every person, it applies to the whole group. When we talk about metaphysical or psychological, okay, the idea should not be metaphysical or psychological, because these two concepts are something that are related to oneself. Metaphysics is something that is very personal, that's a very subjective opinion, and the psychological, again, it belongs to one single person. But when we talk about normative or political, it applies to the group, the whole group. As noted earlier, the conception of the person is worked up from the way citizens are regarded in the public political culture of democratic society, in its basic political texts, and in the historical traditions of the interpretation of those texts. Okay, so how? What is the conception of the person? How that person has to be treated? This is something that is there in the culture of a country through different things like the basic political text. And very simply, they've given us examples here like the constitutions, like the declarations made. So if we have to see how a person is treated in, let's say, our country, India, we simply have to see at the making of the constitution, at the principles basic, the first draft of the constitution. And that will always be the base of how the person is to be treated, how much freedom they have been given, how much equality and justice they have been given. So, constitutions and declarations of human rights are such basic texts which form the baseline of how the conception of a person is in a country, and also the historical tradition. What are the different texts? The epics that we have in our country, because majority of the population do work a lot on those epics, maybe the coming in of different religions, and all of their transformation, social and political transformations throughout. So those historical traditions also account to a very important manner in which a person is conceived in the country, a person is treated and held to be in the country, the idea of the person in the country. Okay, For these interpretations, we look not only to courts, political parties, and statesmen, but also writers and constitutional laws and jurisprudence, and to the more enduring writings of all kinds and that bear on a society's political philosophy. In what sense are citizens regarded as equal persons? Let's say they are regarded as equal in that they are all regarded as having to the essential minimum degree the moral powers necessary to engage in social cooperation over time, over a complete life, and to take part in society as equal citizens. Having these power to this degree, we take as the basis of equality among citizens as persons. That is, since we view society as a fair system of cooperation, the basis of equality is having to the requisite minimum degree the moral and other capacities that enable us to take part fully in the cooperative society of life of society. Thus, the equality of citizen is modeled in the original position by the equality of their representatives. That is, by the fact that these representatives are symmetrically situated in that position and have equal rights in the procedure for reaching agreement. So, when we talk about equality, how are persons equal? We start with the very base thought that all the persons have a sense of and have the true moral powers that we discussed above. So, we start with the idea and we start with the assumption, and it's not quite an assumption, we can call it very near to a fact that all persons have the right sense to what is, a sense of justice and what is a sense of goodness, and those persons have the whole, have all the capacity and ability to implement those ideas to all peoples, and not just himself or herself or the people around him or her, that he or she knows, acquaintances, friends, and families. So, you know not being biased against anybody, the people, all the people will follow and implement a sense of goodness and justice to all the people regardless. And that is what equality will stand from, that because the persons have a very fair and equal system of, and equal moral powers with them, and that is one of the reasons why they have to be treated equally, and they will treat other persons equally. So it is modeled on the original position by the equality of their representatives. And when we talked about original position, of course it meant that you don't know any social or political background of the person for whom you're making laws. So if you're making law for somebody, you're basically a representative of the whole of community, of every and the smallest of groups there are, because you don't know, you might belong to one of those groups. So when you make laws, you will keep in mind that you're making laws for everybody out there, which are fair to everybody, because you are a representative of every, group or sect or ethnicity or caste, creed, gender, sex, whatever, every one of them right out there, because you don't know who you are, you don't have a background check on yourself or any other person. So when you make laws in an original position, you're basically a representative of all those groups and all those different communities out there. I note that in taking the moral powers as the basis of equality, we in fact distinguish between a political society and the many associations within it and across it. The latter are associations that cross political boundaries, such as churches and scientific societies. Some of these associations are communities. Churches and scientific societies again illustrate this, but universities and other cultural institutions are also communities. The members of a community are united in pursuing certain shared values and ends that lead them to support the association and in part bind them to it. Injustice is fairness. A democratic political society has no such shared values and ends apart from those falling under or connected with the political conception of justice itself. The citizens of a well ordered society affirm the Constitution and its political values as realized in their institutions, and they share the end of giving one another justice as society's arrangements require. So, what point he's trying to illustrate is that there are so many associations throughout. If we look beyond a political entity, there are different associations based on, say, religion, say, ethnicity, say, gender, class, caste, creed, or maybe, a certain thought, a certain, form of government. There's so many ways in which communities are formed, and we've also discussed this before, that one person at one point of time is part of so many different communities. One person is also maybe as a student a part of a university or a college, as a, as a boy or girl in the family is part of the society and culture of the family. As a person who goes to the temple is also a part of the religion and the society, or the area that he or she lives in. As a part of the let's say society of a certain area, he's also a member of an area, in some place. So at one point of time, one person is a part of so many different associations, and these societies, some of them also go beyond political boundaries. If we talk about, say, churches or scientific societies, so when a group of scientists, a group of people who have certain hypotheses and conclusions regarding some or the other theorem or something. So in scientific society, they don't look for boundaries, whether a person who's working on it is Indian or American or Canadian. So they basically work for one particular hypothesis to work upon answer to find out what they intend to do. In the same way, churches. So churches, scientific societies, temples, so many other examples where they go beyond the political boundaries. They don't see really into nations, but they have a different goal than the politics of than the country or the citizenship of a country. Okay, so uh, you know when talk about justice as fairness, a democratic political society has no such shared values. So there's one connection between them, and that is the conception of justice itself. So in justice as fairness, we completely neglect all the other associations that a person is part of, because no one person is part of all the associations, etc. So in justice as fairness, Rawls intends to completely ignore all the associations, and by ignore, he doesn't want the people to leave the other association. He only wants that those associations be not discriminated against, and that is why when laws are made, laws be made in such a way that they do not in any way be get discriminated by what associations a person is part of. So Rawls intends to forget all those other associations for that moment of time until a person is in original position or is making laws or is practicing justice as fairness, and just remembers one thing, that all of them are bound in a conception of justice, that all people have to be treated in the sense of justice. Okay, so all citizens are of a well-ordered society. They affirm the constitution, political values, institutions. So they are a part of it. And Rawls is not telling us to ignore it or forget it, but only for the time being. We have to not consider the part that what one person may be a part of of any association. We don't have to consider that part, so there is no bias against one group or community or association. The significance of this distinction between a democratic society and communities within it will become evident later and rest on a number of specific features. So a democratic society is such that have no other shared values, just the thing that they have to follow justice. A democratic society just has one identity, just has one goal of people, and that is very simple conception of justice, following of justice, implementing of justice. And all the other smaller communities, be it on any other grounds based on it, are tend to be forgotten for that period of time, because what we're connected through is we have to be justifiable to the other person. We have to practice justice for the other person, and we have to be just for the other person. For example, we are born into society, and while we may be born into communities also, into religions and their distinctive cultures, only society with its political form of government and its law exercises coercive power. So we may be, that's what he's trying to explain, that we're part of so many different religions, so many different schools, institutions, associations, societies, ethnicity, sex, all of that. But then only one thing that applies to us, one law that applies to us is that of the constitution that is being enforced. So this, those communities, those religions, those associations stop playing their part for that moment of time. While we can leave communities voluntarily, there is a sense in which we cannot leave our political society voluntarily. Also, a community can reward or single out its members in proportion to their contribution to its shared values and ends, but a democratic society has no such shared values and ends by which its citizens can be distinguished. All who can be fully cooperating members of political society count as equals and can be treated differently only as the public political conception of justice allows. So, in the eyes, if we talk about such associations, if we talk about such, communities, if we talk about such communities, and of course you can be a part of a community for one moment and you can leave the community the other another moment. So you can leave and not be a part of a community voluntarily by your own choice. But when or you may be treated differently by a community because you're not following certain rules and standards. For example, you let's say you live in a let's say you're a part of the institution, you're part of a college, university. Okay, as given example here, if you're part of a university and the university applies a rule on you that you have to wear certain uniform to your school or college every day, if you do not follow that, you're not giving you're not following the rules and regulations as being a member of that association. So, if you're a part of that community, you have to follow it. If you don't follow it, strict action may be taken against you. You may be biased against, or there are certain procedures that have to be taken out against you. But in a democratic society, when it comes to treatment of people, the treatment will only be different if it is a certain way that the public conception of justice allows it. Otherwise, you cannot treat a person differently in any way. It is a serious error not to distinguish between the idea of a democratic political society and the idea of community. Of course, so yes, it is very difficult for us to imagine that a community and a democratic society are two complete different things, because our lives are so intermingled between all of them. Of course, a democratic society is hospitable to many communities within it, and indeed tries to be a social world within which diversity can flourish in amity and concord, but it is not itself a community, nor can it be in view of the fact of reasonable pluralism. For that would require the oppressive use of government power, which is incompatible with basic democratic liberties. From the start, then we view a democratic society as a political society that excludes a confessional or an aristocratic state, not to mention a caste, slave, or a racist one. This exclusion is a consequence of taking the moral powers as the basis of political equality. So, in a democratic society, nobody is a slave, nobody is a member of the aristocratic family, nobody is a doctor, engineer, or any other thing. They're just simply members of a democratic society, of a political society, and they only have to follow the sense of justice, they only have to follow the conceptions of justice, and the two moral powers that they possess have to be in use constantly. In what sense are citizens free? So that is what is equality is. That equality is applies to citizens of a democratic society, and they have to be treated equally. They are just one. They're not different. When we talk about in terms of democratic society, they're all equal. They're not different. They cannot be treated differently. But it is something different when it comes to the different communities that exist within. And every society will have community. In what sense are citizens free? Here again, we must keep in mind that justice as fairness is a political conception of justice for a democratic society. The relevant meaning of free persons is to be drawn from the political culture of such a society and may have little or no connection, for example, with freedom of the will as discussed in the philosophy of mind. Following up this idea, we say that citizens are regarded as free persons in two respects. So, when we say that people are free, we never mean that people have freedom of the will, that whatever they wish to do, whatever their will is, they can do that. That is not freedom, what freedom means. So, if we have to regard the person as free, there are two things, there are two respects and two, let's say, characteristics that have to be followed for freedom. First, citizens are free in that they conceive of themselves and of one another as having the moral power to have a conception of the good. This is not to say that, as a part of their political conception, they view themselves as inevitably tied to the pursuit of the particular conception of good which they affirm at any given time. Rather, as citizens, they are seen as capable of revising and changing this conception on reasonable and rational grounds, and they may do so if they so desire. As free persons, Citizens claim the right to view their persons as independent from and not identified with any particular conception of the good or scheme of final ends. Given their moral power to form, to revise, and rationally to pursue a conception of the good, their public or legal identity as free persons is not affected by changes over time in the determinate conception of the good. So whatever, one of the moral powers was that every person have a conception and has a sense of goodness. That sense of goodness, how that has to be interpreted, solely rests on the person. For example, when citizens convert from one religion to another or no longer affirm an established religious faith, they do not cease to be, for questions of political justice, the same persons they were before. So, if suddenly, if a person thinks that, okay, this religion is not good, it's not preaching good values, and this religion, say A religion is not good and B is a religion that is very good, and I belong to A religion previously, but now I changed my religion to religion B from A. So, in the eyes of a democratic society, that is one of the ways that a person is experiencing freedom, because the person's conception of good may change. What goodness means to the person may change, and the democratic society is completely okay and gives the freedom to the person of, having your own conception of goodness. So their public legal identity, that it remains intact, no matter what part of community you belong to. What for you is a conception of good, so that freedom the person has to decide on his own what goodness means. In general, they still have the same basic rights and duties. They own the same property and make the same claims as before, except insofar as these claims are connected with their previous religious affiliation. We can imagine a society in which basic rights and recognized claims depend on religious affiliations and social class. Such a society has a different political conception of the person. It may not have a conception of citizenship at all, if this conception as we're using it goes with the conception of society as a fair system of cooperation for reciprocal advantage between free and equal persons. So that is what one aspect of freedom to the person is, that you have your own conception of of goodness. You have your own choice to make in what you regard as being good and bad. And it is not something that is based on, say, a religious affiliation, that if you belong to a certain religion that means you're good. Your concept of goodness is better than the rest. There's another sense of identity specified by reference to citizens' deeper aims and commitments. Let's call it their non legal and moral identity. Now, citizens usually have both political and non political aims and commitments. There's another sense of identity specified by reference to citizens' deeper aims and commitments. Let's call it their non legal or moral identity. Now, citizens usually have both political and non political aims and commitments. Thus, they affirm the values of political justice and want to see them embodied in political institutions and social policies. There's another sense of identity specified by reference to citizens' deeper aims and commitments. Let's recall it their non legal or moral identity. Now, citizens usually have both political and non political aims and commitments. Thus, they affirm the values of political justice and want to see them embodied in political institutions and social policies. So, before this, we talked about equality of citizens, we basically talked about how a democratic society aims at providing the conception of justice to all the citizens, and how that conception of justice does not have any shared or combined values with any of the other institutions or communities that exist within a democratic society. So, in a democratic society, all persons are very equal, they have the same rights. So, it's a very different scenario, and none of and the person's identity in as a member of the democratic society does not pertain to any other institutions or communities that they are a part of. Now, when we talk about freedom, there's another identity of a citizen apart from the political identity. So there is a moral moral identity and a moral goal of every citizen to be achieved. So they want that these non-political, these moral values, maybe of family values, love, care, happiness, these are some values, these are the moral aspirations of a citizen that they want to incorporate into their political institutions and social policies. So they want that their social policies be such that they provide some moral values and moral identity to their alter moral ego. They want that their social policies be family driven, family supporting, aimed towards the happiness of all, love, care. So this is a kind of atmosphere and a moral feelings that every citizen aspires to incorporate into their social and political policies and institutions. They also work for the other non political values and ends of associations to which they belong. These two aspects of their moral identity, citizens must adjust and reconcile. So, one is the different moral aspirations and identity that they want to incorporate into their political institutions, and another is work for the associations that they are part of, the group that they are part of. For example, if a person is a part of a certain religion, so of course everybody wants that their religion prospers and grows, and they get proper coverage and um reach to all the people. So these are the two different aspects of the moral identity, and every person aspires for to achieve these aspects. It can happen that in their personal affairs or in the internal life of their association, citizens may regard their final ends and attachments very differently from the way political conception supposes. They may have, and often do have at any given time, affections, devotions, and loyalties that they believe they would not, indeed could and should not, stand apart from and evaluate objectively. Okay, so their affection, devotion, loyalties, these are some non political terms, these are some non political aspirations, and they don't want that their political policies, their social policies, stand apart from their moral policies. They want to combine both of them. They may regard it as simply unthinkable to view themselves apart from certain religious, philosophical, and moral convictions. So, of course, even we aspire for such things and for such policies to be incorporated, let's say, our constitution. That apart from the political aspirations and political aims that we are provided with freedom, justice, equality, all of these things, there, our constitution and every other constitution is also a reflection to, you know, family, love, care, growth, happiness. This is all there. Secularism, everything. Okay, so one cannot just completely disengage themselves with their moral identity, with their different associations, affiliations that they are part of, and just focus on their democratic society part. These two kinds of commitments and attachments, political and non political, specify moral identity and give shape to a person's way of life, what one sees oneself as doing and trying to accomplish in the social world. If we suddenly lost them, we would be disoriented and unable to carry on. So, these two, political and non political aspirations, these two make us go on. In fact, there would be, we might think, no point in carrying on. Our conceptions of the good may often do change over time. However, usually slowly but sometimes rather suddenly, when these changes are sudden, we are particularly likely to say that we are no longer the same person. We know what this means. We refer to a profound and pervasive shift or reversal in our final ends and commitments. We refer to a different moral identity. On the road to Damascus, Saul of Tarsus becomes Paul the Apostle. Yet such a conversion implies no change in our public legal identity, nor in our personal identity, as this concept is understood by some writers in the philosophy of mind. And in a well ordered society supported by an overlapping consensus, citizens' political values and commitments are part of their non institutional moral identity as roughly the same. So, when we talk about, in a well ordered society, every citizen aims for it and wants it, that their moral identity be collapsed and be interconnected with their political identity, and all the political aspirations that they have, they do not only fulfill the goal of reaching the political aspirations but the non political aspirations, fulfilling certain or giving them a chance to fulfill their duty as a member of certain institutions and associations that they're a part of. A second respect in which citizens view themselves as free is that they regard themselves as self-authenticating sources of valid claims. Okay, so a second way, one way that they regard themselves free is, or they have the freedom, is to also combine in their moral identity and moral aspirations into their political aspirations and political identity. So this is a kind of freedom, a leverage given to the citizens. Moral principles is something very subjective and very personal. And when we talk about democracy, society, politics, a moral identity and moral aspiration in a scientific way seems very different. But in practical life, when living in society, the moral and the political identities have to be clasped together. And this is something that every citizen wants. Now, a second way in which they themselves view free is that they regard themselves as self authenticating sources of valid claims. So, whatever claims that they are making, the people and the citizens want themselves to be authenticating. That is, they regard themselves as being entitled to make claims on their institution so as to advance their conceptions of the good. These claims citizens regard as having weight of their own apart from being driven from duties and obligations specified by a political conception of justice. For example, from duties and obligations owed to society. Claims that citizens regard are as founded on duties and obligations based on their conception of the good and the moral doctrine they affirm in their own life are also for our purposes here to be counted as self authenticating. So, doing that is reasonable in a political conception of justice for a constitutional democracy, for provided the conceptions of the good and the moral doctrine citizens affirm are compatible with the public conception of justice, these duties and obligations are self authenticating from a political point of view. Now, when we talk about another aspect of freedom, so the people and the citizens have the freedom to call their own aspirations and moral goals and political aims to be self authenticating, or something that they themselves have authenticated or agreed to, they have validated it themselves. Okay, for example, they are as being entitled to make claims on their institutions to advance their conceptions of good. So they themselves are the masters of their own will. They themselves have validated those things, and that is why they're following it, not because of something else or some other reason. And even if they're self-authenticating on the basis of saying it duty or obligation, that it is our duty as a member of the society, it is an obligation to the unity of the society that we have to do these things and we have to follow certain things, those duties and those obligations are also authenticated, validated, and agreed to, basically passed by the citizens themselves. So this is another freedom that the citizens hold with themselves, that they have the right to agree by themselves why they have accepted certain rules and procedures. When we describe the way in which citizens regard themselves as free, we are relying on how citizens tend to think of themselves in a democratic society when questions of political justice arise. So what power, what freedom do they have, and till what place can they go to think about themselves too? That this aspect belongs to a particular political conception is clear from the contrast with a different political conception in which the members of society are not viewed as self authenticating sources of valid claims. In this case, their claims have no weight except insofar as they can be derived from the duties and obligations owed to society or from their ascribed roles in a social hierarchy justified by religious or aristocratic values. So, if let's say if those certain let's say their claims have not been self authenticated by them, have not been validated by the citizens, then it is just something that the religion or the aristocracy or the more powerful are just giving them, throwing at them, and they are just they're following it. So this is a kind of freedom that every citizen have, that all the claims, all the rules and regulations in the political aspect of the society are being made and they're following. All of that is something that they have agreed to and they very willingly accept it. To take an extreme case, slaves are human beings who are not counted as sources of claims, not even claims based on social duties or obligations, for slaves are not counted as capable of having duties or obligations. Laws that prohibit the abuse and maltreatment of slaves are not founded on claims made by slaves in their own behalf, but on claims originating either from their slaveholders or from the general interest of society. Slaves are, so to speak, socially dead. They're not recognized as persons at all. This contrasts with the political conception of justice that allows slavery makes clear why conceiving of citizens as free persons in virtue of their moral powers and they having a conception of the good goes with a particular political conception of the justice. So here I have given, Rawls has given as an example of how freedom, of how when you say that the claims you make are self-authenticating, how is that an aspect of freedom that the citizens are provided with. And he's taken the example of slaves. What happens with slaves are that whatever rules, regulations, and claims that are directly or indirectly affecting these slaves, none of them have been made or authenticated or validated by the slaves or the slave community or even the representatives of the slaves. So all of those claims that have been made for the slaves, by none of them are by the slaves or by the representatives or slaves. So they have been made not from the point of view of slavery or the slaves, but from the slaveholders, their masters. So none of those claims are self-authenticating. None of the, even if we talk about that, okay, what claims have been made for the slaves, what rules and regulations have been made for the slaves, they are as a duty to the society, their obligation, they owe it to the society, they owe it to the commonwealth of the society, the unity of the society. Even that saying does not go with it, and the reason for that is that slaves are socially dead. Slaves are not considered as active political citizens of the nation, of the country. So, slaves are basically commodities or entities. They're not persons with their own political or moral identity. And that is why slaves do not have the freedom. They do not have the freedom to form their own laws, to make their own claims, and even authenticate them. I emphasize that the conception of the person as free and equal is a normative conception. It is given by our moral and political thought and practice, and it is studied by moral and political philosophy and by the philosophy of law. Since ancient Greece, both in philosophy and in law, the concept of the person has been that of someone who can take part in or play a role in social life and hence who can exercise and respect its various rights and duties. So when we say that the conception of a person is as free and equal, it is a normative conception. The normative, as quite repetitive so many times, normative is something that is practical, that is applicable right to the life, to the T. Okay, it's not something on theory, it's not something on paper. So normative is what is applicable to the practical life and what is practiced, what affects the practicality of life. Okay, so the conception is given by our moral and political thought and practice, and is studied by moral and political philosophy and philosophy of law. So during, even from the times of ancient Greece, in philosophy, in law, you find these conceptions of persons as free and equal. You find these conceptions of the political identity of the people and the moral identity of the people. So both of these identities have been there in the arenas of philosophy and political science and law and moral philosophy. Okay, so the concept of the person has been that of someone who can take part in or play a role in social life. So, what constitutes a person, a politically active person, is who can take part in their social life, who can then complete their role. Every person has a part, has a role to play in the social and political life. So, somebody who can complete that role and fulfill their duties, and who can always actively take part in the making of the social life and the working of it, who can exercise and respect its various rights and duties, both. Not just that a person is fulfilling the duties and then he or she is you know an active citizen of the nation or country. The person can exercise their rights as well as their duties, both of them. In specifying the central organizing idea of society as a fair system of cooperation, we use the companion idea of free and equal persons as those who can play the role of fully cooperating members, as suits a political conception of justice that views society as a fair system of cooperation. A citizen is someone who can be a free and equal participant over a complete life. Okay, so a citizen is regarded as a person who has the freedom and who is an equal participant over a complete life in all the social and political duties, the roles that she or has to play, even the rights that are given to the person. So the person uses those rights, completes his duties, that is what a person is, a citizen is, and he has free and equal, participant. He's free, he has the freedom, he has equality, he's an equal participant with, equal share of resources as any other citizen. This conception of the person is not to be mistaken for the conception of a human being, as the latter might be specified in biology or psychology without the use of normative concepts of various kinds, including, for example, the concepts of the moral powers and of the moral and political virtues. So, a citizen is very different from a human. In a biological sense, a human is a very different entity. So, there are certain ways or certain characteristics that will be explained in biology of who a human is, but a citizen is very different from a human. All citizens are humans, but it is not necessary that all humans are citizens. Like we talked about slaves, or maybe in some parts of the world, the extreme tribal people who are completely cut off from the society, who do not take part in the working of the society, they may be considered as humans but not as citizens, because they neither are they exercising their rights nor their duties. They're not a part of the political society of the democratic society. Moreover, to characterize the person, we must add to these concepts those used to formulate the powers of reason, inference, and judgment. So, there are certain criteria that are needed. The first is that the person possesses the moral powers, the political virtues, and the person has reason, the person has inference, the person has judgment. These are essential companion powers to the two moral powers and are required for their exercise or the practice of the virtues. So, the two moral powers that they have the sense of justice and the sense of goodness. With that, they should have reason, they should have judgment, proper judgment, and they should have the power of inference, inferring something from, a given fact. So that these are some essential criteria that are needed for a human to be called a citizen. So this is a criteria that has been listed for a human to be called a citizen. Relation between the fundamental ideas. Now, until now, we have studied about 5 to 6 to 7 fundamental ideas: the idea of a well-ordered society, of free and equal persons, the idea of original possessions, and so. Now, what is the relation between all of these fundamental ideas? So we have discussed 5 fundamental ideas. Okay, so we first, the idea of society as a fair system of cooperation, idea of a well-ordered society, idea of basic structure of a society, idea of original position, and finally the idea of citizens as engaged in cooperation as being free and equal. Now let's start with the organizing idea of society as a fair system of cooperation and make it more determinate by spelling out what results when this idea is fully realized. Okay, so we start with, this is basically, all of this has been given in a sequence. If we start with the idea of a society as a fair system of cooperation, so when we reach to its full potential, we actually have made the well ordered society. Okay, and the idea then applies to the basic structure. Okay, then we say that this fair terms of cooperation are specified by the original position when the people and the parties, the lawmakers are in the original provision position, and then how persons engaged are regarded to be free and equal citizens. So there's a connect between the fundamental ideas, and they're given in a sequence. One happens only after the other. Now, of course, you can't have persons as being free and equal when you don't fulfill the basic criteria of the society as well ordered, or there are fair system of cooperation, fair terms of cooperation. This spelling out of the central organizing idea of social cooperation is not deductive argument. The steps starting with the idea and proceeding to the next are not said to follow from or to be derived from. We or specify the organizing idea and make it more determinate as we connect it with the other ideas. So all of these ideas are standing alone ideas. Okay, so they're basically individual ideas, but then we need to connect the ideas to each other to make one idea even more stronger. Okay, so there may be possible that it is possible that the citizens may be free and equal, but the well ordered society has not been reached. But of course, that's a very far away case. And then to make it more clear, more determinate, and more concrete, we need to have a well ordered society some way or the other. Or even if we, let's say we don't start with a well ordered society and we start with citizens being free and equal, so somewhere in the process we will ultimately have to reach to, you know, a well ordered society, because without that, being free and equal citizens, being free and equal is something very, very difficult, or let's say next to not being possible. Okay, so we we are not following it. It's not that after fair system of cooperation, after that we have this well ordered society, after that we have original. That's not the case. We're not following it. It's not a step by step procedure or a sequence, but all those ideas are very well connected to each other. They may not be directly dependent to each other, but there's a very strong connect with all the ideas. Let's say there are various ways of specifying the central idea of social cooperation. We might say that fair terms of cooperation are fixed by natural law, viewed either as God's law or given by a prior and independent moral order publicly known by rational intuition. Such ways of fixing those terms have not been excluded by deductive argument. For instance, by showing them to be incompatible with the idea of social cooperation. Instead, they are ruled out by the historical conditions and the public culture of democracy that set the requirements for public conception of justice in a modern constitutional regime. Among those historical conditions is the fact of reasonable pluralism, which rules out comprehensive doctrines as a basis for a workable political agreement on a conception of justice. Since justice's fairness looks for such a basis, it follows a different course. Okay, so it's not that when we talk about, you know, social cooperation, the fair terms of cooperation may be reached by saying that it was a God's law. It is something that the nature has given us, that the moral order has given us, so we have to follow nonetheless. So we may follow the fair terms of cooperation and we may not need a well ordered society. Okay, so such ways of fixing those terms have not been excluded by deductive argument by showing them to be incompatible with the idea of social cooperation. So instead, they are ruled out by the historical conditions and the public culture of democracy that set the requirements for a political concept of justice in a modern constitutional regime. So, somewhere or the other, there is a shadow of one idea over the other. There may not be a direct connect. One idea may not result directly from the second idea. It's not that one idea is, you know, born out of the previous fundamental idea, but there's a shadow of each idea over each other. So there's a circle going around which connects all of those ideas. We cannot tell in advance whether the idea of social cooperation and its two companion ideas will provide the organizing ideas we need for a workable political conception of justice. The public political culture is not unambiguous. It contains a variety of possible organizing ideas that might be used instead, various ideas of liberty and equality and other ideas of society. So it may be necessary that we have accepted or we have adopted the, let's say, the idea of a well-ordered society, and it may happen so that, you know, the idea of free and equal citizens are not adopted. There may be so many other ways in which the society may be organized, or the citizens have different political notions of themselves or political aspirations, and freedom and equality may not be one of them. So it is completely possible because there are so many alternate ways in which the society could work up itself. All we need to claim is that the idea of society as a fair system of cooperation is deeply embedded in that culture, and so it is not unreasonable to examine its merits as a central organizing idea. The point is that whatever idea we select as the central organizing idea cannot be fully justified by its own intrinsic reasonableness, as its intrinsic reasonableness cannot suffice for that. Such an idea can be fully justified only by the conception of political justice, to which it eventually leads when worked out, and how well that conception coexists with our considered convictions of political justice at all levels of generality. In what we may call wide reflective equilibrium, the idea of reflective equilibrium connects with that of political public justification, to which we now turn. So we may say that the society, let's say we have accepted the idea of a well-ordered society. So it's not necessary that when we have accepted one fundamental idea, the other fundamental idea will be achieved. But then if the other fundamental idea is not achieved, somewhere or the other, the fun idea that we have adopted as a very central organizing theme of our society, it's it will not be fully justified and fully reached to what it should have been. So now, in 9 and 10, we're going to discuss about reflective equilibrium. We're going to discuss about idea of public justification. Okay, so these two are again very important ideas, and they will somewhere or the other tell us how all of these fundamental ideas that have been shared, they are so deeply connected to each other, and how each of these ideas are required to completely fulfill and justify the other fundamental idea. So even without one, you know somewhere or the other, we have a shadow of each fundamental idea over the other one when we adopt it as a center organizing idea, and we need every each one of them to achieve the fullest potential and completely justify every other uh, fundamental idea.